My sights drifted as I saw the priest lift the bottle above his head, ready to hurl into the inferno, and I heard an unmistakable sound. I was far away from home and looking for somewhere to rest for the night. Having on more than one occasion run into a particularly brave group of cambions and the sky growing darker, my time was running low. I sought for shelter in any available door, but most were either locked, blocked, or uninhabitable, spoiled and blackened by fire or rot and mould. I would certainly have become sick had I stayed in them. With the quality of danger currently found on the streets of London, it would feel humiliating to die of something as petty as a respiratory infection, so I looked to find sanctuary elsewhere. After what felt like hours of silently trying door handles and lifting windows, I eventually found an unlocked, still closed door, beside which sat a horseless carriage, ragged and torn. Apparently untouched for all of these years, the interior was remarkably clean. Had the district not been such a dangerous one, I almost certainly would have made this place my new lodgings. A veil of dust seemed to have been cast evenly across every inch of every room, particles caught in the last rays of light shining through windows awkwardly covered with planks seemed to almost exhale upward from the floor with every footstep I took on the intricately decorated Axminster rug. I wasted no time looking at the fineries that could be found in the residence. Such things, fine as they were, are ultimately useless now. So I began to unpack everything unnecessary for immediate survival on the floor of the first room I found, bringing only the items I might need for combat, and began to inspect the rest of the house. The terraced building was perhaps 3 stories high. There was most likely an attic and a cellar or pantry sitting on top and underneath respectively. Usually if I found a closed door, it would remain that way, unless I heard anything from behind. After a slow and careful assessment of the house, I deemed it as reasonably safe to inhabit for the night. There were 1 or 2 open windows that would stay as such due to the noise created when closing them, so I gently closed the doors to the rooms in which they were situated and left them alone. The sun had well and truly set for the evening, and night was very much here. I had decided on a room which featured a large, ornately decorated, comfortable armchair I thought apt to sleep in, as it was easier to rise from in an emergency, next to which my pistol and canteen sat, nearing empty. The nights were bitterly cold and quite far from quiet. The distant sounds of the screech of a volak or the crashing destruction of murmur beasts were often heard. However, here, specifically, you would hear the insane ramblings of people taken by blight, or the groans and nonsenses of those whose minds had succumbed entirely to the disease or possession. I personally could not decide which I felt was worse. Though a shambling, malnourished bag of bones armed with naught but a rake or stick may not sound all that difficult to deal with, in numbers the cambions proved to be quite a problem. Bond Street, being home to some of the higher echelons of London's classes, meant the people here, although certainly had time enough to have their minds infected with blight and their thoughts become no longer their own, had not the time to become as weakened or as slow as those you would find in poorer districts, such as mine. This meant they were faster, stronger, and they had more tendency towards strategy, rather than aimlessly flailing whatever pointed or blunt object was in their hand at the time. They would calculate their attack and do so with immeasurable ferocity. I had placed a pillow on a short 3-legged wooden stool by the window in order to have a reasonably good view of any passing threats. The boards covering the window would provide me with just enough cover to hide should anyone be attracted to this building in particular. Another person, for instance, caught in the night with nowhere to go. They must be resisted at all costs. In spite of how difficult it may be, I have to fight the urge to help. Usually they would cause an almighty din by screaming and banging on doors, pleading for entry. Those who let them in would almost certainly soon meet their demise, along with the poor soul who found themselves outside, unprepared, and alone at night. The night was particularly dangerous for a few reasons, aside from the usual monstrosities you would find during the day on various streets. Bodaks were more common, and their infinitely more dangerous cousin, the shade siren, would frequent the night with ease, almost entirely unseen as they could traverse valleys and roads in the open. Volaks would also settle in groups I have called massacres. Being that they are descended of crows and other corvids, only more violent and sadistic, I thought I would upgrade their pluralization to match their tendencies. They stand atop buildings and watch in silence, never sleeping, looking for an easy target and listening through misshapen holes situated arbitrarily on their seemingly flame-scorched heads. As my eyes grew heavy by the window, I stood up with intentions to retire to the armchair for the night, but I noticed a gentle flickering of warm yellow light on the dilapidated cart situated outside. I watched it unblinkingly, my eyelids now feeling as if I had slept for hours, and I listened intensely. I could hear what sounded like a faint whistling coming from somewhere down the street. It didn't sound near, but it was certainly nearing. As I sat and focused on the sound, the light cast on the broken wheels of the cart grew brighter and flickered more wildly. I noticed the whistle I had been hearing was not whistling. It was screaming. I leaned to the opposite side of the window, looking down the street in the direction of the noise and light to see a figure holding a torch above their head and walking with impunity. It was a man, I was almost certain. Suddenly another popped into view, then another. A whole procession of men, women and children were marching down the street, accompanied by the horrifying scream of a woman, and now what sounded like a man. A preacher. Heretics, I whispered to myself. Now the army of what must have been 100 people was nearing my window. I could hear the grind of a horse and cart, the man's voice clearly spouting verses from a twisted tome I was yet to encounter. In the middle of the undulating sea of people and flame, the blasphemous cleric stood atop the cart, dressed in black and red, his clerical collar pinned sideways and dotted with blood, now hanging down from his neck. He was pulled by two large horses, covered in shredded, filthy black sheets on which large red glyphs were painted, reminiscent of the alchemical symbol for sulfur, and disturbingly similar to the icon I had received upon becoming an Angelmaker. As he awkwardly tried to keep his balance on the unevenly cobbled streets, he passed the window I was looking through. I turned to look once again down the street to the source of the screaming. A woman laid on a cart that resembled a pulled rickshaw, powered by 3 men. It looked as if planks were missing from it. It seemed to almost be only the supporting structure of the cart itself that remained. She was wearing a dirtied, once white gown of sorts. It was difficult to tell due to it being so damaged and torn, but she was surprisingly well covered. Her screaming grew louder and more shrill as she passed. It seemed to pierce through me like an unexpected icy gust of wind on a winter day. And it was only then I saw the true horror and reason for her desperation. Her hands were tied to a long post behind her head. There was blood on her feet and knees. She had been nailed to a cross. She was about to be crucified. I had only witnessed the aftermath of a heretic crucifixion. Even that I had only seen a handful of times, the most recent being maybe a few weeks or months ago. I had been studying the heretics to figure out exactly what it was they believed in, and had discovered a small outpost in Kensington. I watched from a distance for days, people coming and going as you would expect of any small community, until, without expectation, they all began to leave. Ordinarily, it would be 1 or 2 leaving at a time, presumably to gather and forage for necessities from empty homes and shops. On this occasion, however, it was everyone. Horses, carts, livestock, they seemed to be moving their camp entirely and leaving the makeshift houses and shacks behind. I had sat and watched the well-protected village for approximately an hour before I cautiously made my way to the now abandoned community. A circular wall comprised of large, sharpened stakes forced my point of entry to a large pair of similarly constructed open gates. Upon entering, I was met with an entire town, fabricated from the scraps and remains of destroyed buildings, held together with a near expert level of craftsmanship. I found my way around worn-in paths that reduced the soft ground to a mire that lined the streets and lanes, staring in awe at the industrious efforts these people had made to create a genuine civilization. As I walked to the center of the village, I encountered a charred and still smoking corpse, barely hanging upside down by its feet. The hands and forearms now skeletal and dangling either side of what was now just a skull into a pile of ash. Just south of the middle, where the fire once raged, sat a badly blackened crucifix, inverted. Oftentimes the crucifix would collapse, causing it to fall forwards, making the victim suffer the torment of being pinned into the fire. Though this may seem like poor planning, everything in a heretic crucifixion is by design. The cross is situated in such a way that the fires lick at the front of the person first, rather than engulfing them fully in flame, making the death last longer. They are also upside down with their arms free, leaving them to desperately flail in vain attempts to guard themselves or find freedom. Exceptionally long nails are hammered through the feet, shins, and knees into a thick, sturdy wooden frame. The hands would only be set free once the crucifix was in place. The stench of burning flesh remaining in the air was firmly implanted in my memory. It was what I would assume the cause of the piles of vomit that lay splattered across the remains of the very recently deserted encampment. Either that or the absolute disgust at what they had seen. Though, had that been the case, they very likely would have met their demise the same way shortly after. Now this undoubtedly sounds like one of the worst possible fates imaginable for a human to be forcibly subjected to. But this is, if anything, showing mercy compared to the suffering one would experience from a true crucifixion. Although agonizing, the flames would burn away the oxygen, causing the victim death by suffocation before it would even be possible to burn to death. But I digress. The wheeled repugnancy that carried the poor screaming girl crunched to a halt outside of my window, and people began to communicate inaudibly, pointing towards the cart that had sat broken in the street for God knows how long. One of them ran down the procession to the ranting cleric and caught his attention. The man spoke to him as he turned to look at the cart. The priest responded with a nod, and the gathering stopped before he stepped down from his makeshift pulpit. The priest made his way casually along his flock of followers. The thick, beaten book that was previously waving over his head in his hand as he spouted nonsense was now under his arm, the red ribbon bookmark dangling limply from the spine. He reached the broken carriage and assessed it before shouting back down the street to the others.
"Yes, this will do."
Shortly after a brief conversation, people from the crowd began to kick and wrench at the decaying wood of the cart, breaking pieces off and casting them aside into a pile for a reason I was as of yet unsure. A man in the middle of the street, armed with a shovel and a pickaxe, began to swing and hit at the cobbled paving, lifting one of the larger stones out and digging underneath to create a large hole. No, not here, not now, I thought to myself. The men that were previously pulling the cart that carried the girl moved it into position before the newly dug hole and began to lift it from the rear. Another man affixed a rope to the top by the girl's feet and pulled from the opposite side, sliding the crucifix ungracefully across the rickshaw's horizontal foundations as another guided the shorter end into the mouth of the narrow pit. Once the tip of the crucifix was firmly lodged into the hole, the men lifting the cart moved around to the front and assisted the man in elevating the large, uneven, inverted cross as it thudded into the floor. A crowd had now coalesced around the scene, some gathering pieces from the pile of discarded wood that sat next to what was now nothing short of 4 wheels by the side of the road, placing them with little care on the floor below the victim's head, now sobbing and pleading for them not to do what they had planned. Others were stuffing scraps of cloth and hay into a pile, bulking its size considerably, some placing handmade trinkets and other tributes into the pyre. The priest stood at the base of the unlit bonfire and stared with no trace of remorse into the face of his sacrifice, streaked with mud and dirt that collected in her tears as she sobbed quietly. He then turned to his congregation.
Before us stands an opportunity for an act of repentance.
He shouted across the crowd, now silent and motionless.
Feel no sorrow for this creature. Though she may look just like you or I, she is nothing more than a tool. A tool placed here by the diabolic overseer of perspicacity. A soul guilty of free thought or daring even to ponder the existence of the great abyss. Her act of questioning the nature of reality in itself is an insult to the aspects. The arrogance and audacity of one who disbelieves what is in front of her very eyes must be returned to whence it came.
The crowd cheered in unison. This can't happen, I thought to myself. I have to do something. But what? What could I do? I was outnumbered 100 to 1, and I had absolutely no means of escape once they knew where I was. Initiating combat with my blade was out of the question. Outrunning them was a risky option, and that would be after somehow removing the girl from the crucifix, leaving her to defend herself with crippled legs. As I went over countless scenarios in my head, I made my way slowly over to the chair in which I had intended to sleep, and gently picked up my pistol. I then moved back to the window, the soles of my boots barely caressing the rug so as not to cause a creak from the floorboards underneath. The priest still ranted on. Curiously, he turned back and approached the girl, carelessly and violently tearing a scrap of fabric from her already worn and mangled dress. Then, walking back to the crowd, a man handed him a clear bottle, one once used perhaps for beer or medicine, within which was an oily substance, yellow-tinged and only slightly thicker than water. The priest stuffed the rag into the end of it and held it to his side. The rattle of matchboxes could suddenly be heard in the hands of the people situated around the girl, as she looked around at them frenetically. Her breaths now short, she began again to beg and scream for mercy. No, I can't let this be, I thought to myself. My conscience battled to and fro as my hands raced to my temples. If you draw attention to yourself, you will die. If you do nothing, you will have to live with this. There must be something you can do. Shoot the priest and run? Distract the crowd and draw them to me? Fucking think! A mercy killing. I might not be able to save the girl, but I could spare her the torment of being crucified and burned alive. My pistol was never unloaded, but it only carried one shot. I absolutely could not miss my target. My aim was extraordinary, but the variables were numerous, and the problem still persisted of drawing attention to myself. Someone could move in the way, the girl would almost certainly be flailing wildly if they lit the pyre before I could grace her with a swift death. I needed a distraction. My time was running desperately short.
And with this conflagration we submit to you a tribute, O Morning Star, Illuminator, and Lord of all aspects.
The priest yelled maniacally, holding the weathered book towards the girl. The scrape of matchsticks was heard as pinpricks of light manifested in the fingers of those nearest to the sacrifice. One by one, they placed them into the bonfire. 2 men pulled at the ropes, holding the girl's arms out across the horizontal beam, freeing them. She swung her arms and pulled desperately at the nails through her knees to no avail as she screamed in agony. The priest could be seen alighting the rag, dangling from the bottle with a match held by the man beside him. With no plan for escape, I aligned my shot as the flames caught the tinder and spread slowly. My hands trembling, I tried desperately to focus my sights on the girl's head, thrashing wildly around as the fire beneath her grew bigger. The blaze began to lick and singe her long hair, draping frighteningly close to the fire. Soon the flames clawed up at her like hands reaching up to her face, her blonde hair now completely engulfed. "Fucking take the shot, you coward!" I screamed internally. My sights drifted as I saw the priest lift the bottle above his head, ready to hurl into the inferno, and I heard an unmistakable sound. The priest turned before he could release the bottle and looked with horror as a Volak quickly descended on him from behind, lifting him by his clothing up into the air. His robes let out an audible rip as they slipped through the bird's enormous claws, and he was thrown with immense force into the monstrosity he and his followers had constructed. He hit the crucifix with such power the beam placed into the floor arched and splintered, causing it to fall heavily to the ground outside of the flame. The bottle in his hand fell to the floor, shattering and causing the flame to rapidly spread around him and intensify. The girl, still ablaze, furiously patted at herself, shrieking in pain. The man arose with his back arched within the ferociously raging fire he had started, screaming and hollering as his clothing welded itself to his blistering skin under the intense heat. He clawed desperately at his skin, as if trying to pull the fire from his body, only to remove handfuls of charred flesh. His followers watched with revulsion, some covering their mouths, some turning away and crying, and some seeming to lose sound mind altogether, until eventually the screams stopped, his lifeless silhouette hanging motionless, his face caught in a perpetual moment of incomprehensible pain. The onlookers began to mumble and talk to each other, confused and knowing not what to do with themselves. Was this a sign? Were they burning someone they weren't meant to, or was this just bad luck? When soon the chatter faded into silence and the crowd looked around them. Unbeknownst even to me, during this horrific yet just series of events, a flock of what must have been 20 Volaks had assembled themselves around the audience, standing there menacing the crowd like statues, frighteningly illuminated by the still-burning priest. People began to cry and whimper as the realization of their own mortality firmly took place in their heads. The birds simply watched on as the group clustered together more and more tightly, some even climbing on top of others as if there was some way to escape. There was no escape. Their fates had been sealed. About 30 minutes had passed since the screaming had stopped. The sun had begun to rise and the Volaks, as far as I could tell, had left a few minutes earlier. Having checked the window already, I assembled my things and got ready to leave, unprepared for what awaited me outside. The door opened just a little, and with difficulty. It was, as I assumed, a corpse preventing me from doing so. It leaned decapitated, and having alarmingly sprayed blood high enough to reach the top of the alcove in which the door was situated. Avoiding the drops of blood falling from the source above me, I squeezed my way through the gap I had made in the doorway, and stepped into the street. Before me sat countless bodies, torsos, and body parts. Blood trickled and flooded the gaps between the cobbled road and gathered at the sides before the pavement. To count the corpses would have been an impossible feat. Counting the pieces of corpse would actually be an easier task to fulfill. Trying to focus as little as possible on the gouged eyes and cavernous recesses that replaced what were once faces littering the street, I thought it worthy of my time to see what useful items people might have. I found very little of use, aside from a satchel filled with glass bottles identical to that which the priest held, and containing what I now discovered to be lamp oil. As I sat and pondered potential future uses for such a thing, my ears pricked up as I heard a faint wheezing from beyond the charred remains of the priest, on its knees and still screaming in torment. With hastened steps I approached the source of the noise, and laid there, badly burned and still affixed to the crucifix now splintered and bent, was the girl. I kneeled down beside her and held my hand gently to her cheek. She shuddered and winced, her blistered and blackened skin too painful to touch. I quickly rescinded my hand.
Please,
she said weakly. I spent a moment kneeling beside her, placing my hand on her chest, looking into her blue, tearful eyes, now pockmarked with burst blood vessels and grit. I could feel the weak and slow thump of a heart, ready to rest at last. I stood up, drew my pistol, and with reluctance, I held the sights firmly between her eyes. She looked back at me, allowing a smile to tremble across her face. And with the last of her strength, she nodded. Thank you for sitting with me and listening tonight. I hope you enjoyed yourself despite the overall morbid nature of the story. If you find yourself wanting more, then please do feel free to subscribe. Also, Eli will relay all comments and feedback to me, so do let me know your thoughts and feelings. Or, if you have any questions, perhaps I could devote some time to answering these at a later date. I tremendously appreciate you having spent your time with me, and I look forward to seeing you again.